On this episode of Clone Talk.
No matter what scale you're at, it's almost always less expensive than the requisite increased product or increased labor costs because your own time is worth a lot to you, right? You don't get any more of that. By knowing the science behind it, you know what you're doing, how it works, and you also know that it works because you know the science backing it, rather than just trusting somebody who tells you that it's this magical product that just benefits the plant man. You know, it just makes the immune system gooder. I feel like things could get a little bit worse before they get better, to be honest, in some ways, in a legislative way. I have cautious optimism.
Hey team, Clone Coach here. Are you tired of struggling with your clones? Slow rooting times, purple stems, yellow growth, damping off, and so much more. Now, wherever you are in the world, the best tool to have in your nursery are the Clone Coach SOPs. These SOPs provide step-by-step instructions and expert guidance to get you the best clones ever. Join the team today at clonecoach.com. Welcome to Clone Talk, the past, present, and future of cannabis nurseries through the eyes of industry professionals. On today's episode, we have Matthew joining us. Matthew, how are you?
I'm doing very well.
Thank you for joining Clone Talk and joining me today to chat a little bit about your expertise here and provide the audience some value. But where are you joining us from today?
I'm here in San Diego, California, USA.
Yeah, good point. Mention that USA because there's people all over the world. Yeah. I lived in San Diego for a little while. I'm actually in Palm Springs, so just right on the other side of the mountain. So when did cannabis become a part of your life kind of for good, whether professionally or personally?
Well, to be honest, as a teenager growing up and also as an adult with a friend who had been smoking for a pretty big part of his life already, a close friend, I'd been offered several times, but I'd always rejected it primarily because not that I had any problem with it or people who had smoked it. I was actually quite a supporter, even though I didn't partake at the time. But because originally my career path was going to be, or was gearing up to be, actually in the military. I come from a military family, and so that would have made that very difficult.
Yeah.
But I never really had a problem with it. I was raised with parents that were also not really having an issue with it at all. So anyways, long story short, I became much more interested in it when I was in my early 20s. And also, I had not gone that pathway, essentially, and I had chosen to go into horticultural work because that was something that I've always been passionate about, is insects, fungi, and these interesting microbes and things that permeate the world. As a kid, I was very interested in that academically, but I also had this other career path I wanted to go in. So I chose the first one instead of the one that I'd known as a kid and from family ties.
Excellent, excellent. So, I mean, it doesn't really sound like the old stigma that was always floating around with, being associated with cannabis didn't affect you too much, or did it growing up?
No, not really. I think a big part of that is growing up. I did grow up in California, so there's a different cultural atmosphere, I would say. So
Yeah,
definitely
absolutely.
a product of that.
We're absolutely the home of it, and I mean, me personally, I had a little bit of stigma, just because the propaganda from the '80s and the Dare programs and stuff were kind of instilled in my parents and my family, but slowly but surely they became advocates themselves. So that's its own path too. But you said you were really interested in the insects and the fungi and the microbes and all that, all those living organisms that really kind of dictate the world and all of the things that are happening. When did that kind of become the beginning of like your professional career working with that subject?
That started in 2010. This is basically when I also started helping people out with cannabis, essentially, because I had friends who had already known, and they already knew me. Anyone who knew me as the guy who knows the bugs, the bug guy, right? And so even as a child and also as a teenager, I was interested in these sorts of things, and I already kind of became somewhat of an encyclopedia, and then that was very helpful with the biology direction they went in the collegiate work, right?
Mm-hmm.
I spent 2 years in China, in the People's Republic of China as well. Essentially, I decided that the way that I could make the biggest impact and the most valuable impact for people would be by taking a lot of this esoteric information that I learned through personal interest and also through college,
Uh-huh.
and essentially take that and make it more easy for people to understand. And at that time, there had also been a pretty large movement towards science communication and the importance of that in academia, because a lot of information, it's nuanced and people might have the wrong approach in analyzing some research, or it might be confusing. And there's a massive movement now, but it was kind of starting to become much more of a snowball effect around that time as well. So I decided that would be something that I would do. So I also had a YouTube channel that I started called Zenthanol. And so that's also where the name Zenthonal Consulting sort of is connected in that way. And so then I decided to make a bunch of videos and footage from my work, but also from just things that were interesting to me or that I thought that people should know, especially with regards to like identification, which is a major thing that people might not have a lot of resources for.
Mm-hmm.
I've also encountered a lot of people in the professional space where I think for understandable reasons, they're very protective of the things that they take, which is like pictures and footage and that kind of a thing. So I'm very fastidious about making sure that people get the credit that they deserve for that sort of a thing, but also that that information is more available. In some cases, I think that I've even drawn some ire for being a little bit like forward with this information. Some things are maybe like not trade secrets, but I guess it's like, that could have been a byway to get a consult, right? Like, oh, they would have called me and then we could have had this conversation, or we could go through all these steps when people could actually just learn the information and make an informed decision. And I'm a huge supporter of that. If your business model is not better than a Google search, you have a bad business model.
I love that. That is something I could definitely agree with and attach to as principles in conducting yourself as, professionals in the space, right? I mean, the information shouldn't be, what's held, behind some gates, right? You got to give. And I use the same strategy for my, coaching as well. It's just give. You got to give tangible results, things that people could implement, today, tomorrow, these next days, and start seeing results. When you do that, I mean, that is huge value, right? And like you said, if your business model stops at a Google search, you're not going to last very long. So, having to bring more value to the table than that is a thing that I really respect and admire about, your strategy there. So let's transition a little bit into, you kind of alluded, Zenthonal Consulting. Let's touch on that on a high level. What is Zenthonal Consulting and what's your role there?
So basically, my whole livelihood is connected to the prevention and management of pests in agricultural space. And I've worked with various people, various crops, ornamentals. I've worked with vegetables. I've worked with tea when I was in China, for example. And I've also worked with cannabis. And at this point, I've worked in cannabis more than I worked with all the other crops. At this point, after 12 years, that is the case. And the importance of training and educating people to understand what the correct domain knowledge is and how to implement strategies that give the best return for any sort of input that they're trying to accommodate, and having that be empirically based rather than something that is an approach that is more reactive, observational, and also perhaps in some cases couched in a little bit of superstition or maybe even a misconception. which there are a lot of because, well, it's a very technical subject. You have to think about all of these various things if you're trying to be ecologically conscientious. You have to understand how, like, the biocontrols you're using might be having a negative effect on the environment around you. People don't necessarily think about that. They might not realize that they'll be perhaps selecting for resistant strains of populations of insects or mites when they use certain compounds, or that certain compounds are a bad idea because they're systemic and they get into the plant, and you could harm or damage somebody or somebody else or yourself by misapplying them.
Those are very good points there. I mean, because the implementation of these strategies is what's so critical. Because when facilities have an outbreak of some sort, it's not like they've never Googled how to prevent this outbreak or how to treat this outbreak, or done covered what they would say covered their bases as far as knowledge goes. But the actual implementation, the actual 360 degrees of looking at other variables that may interfere with what you're trying to implement is really the strategy that's critical that actually gets you results. So like I like where your heads and where your strategy is there, because it has to be a full-fledged attack and a strategy, not just, oh well, it's this one particular product, you spray it once, why don't I have 100% result in a day? There's a lot of I guess like you said, misconceptions, and also people got to adjust their expectations as well, right? With what their implementations, what results they'll get from that. So what packages or what do you offer clients? Is it on-site consulting? Is it remote consulting? I know you've done a lot of you've written a lot of books, articles, a lot of facts out there, a lot of information. So what do you kind of offer and package up for clients?
So essentially, I offer three different kinds of packages. There's an a la carte version as well. But the main thing that I offer is the value of having the information for making informed decisions that are more economical than the result of a reactionary measure. Because most of my focus is on preventative work, to be honest. But in a lot of cases, I do not work with people in a preventative manner, because something that is true for biosecurity, it's also true for physical security and other kinds of security, cybersecurity, which is that people don't know the threat until they experience it. They don't go out to learn about these things because it's not a very romantic topic, right? It's sort of a logistical thing. It's not a very it's just not very attractive. People don't want to focus on that. They want to focus on, how do I make my buds larger, my fruit bigger?
Yeah.
How do I grow taller? Which is also very important. Don't get me wrong, but a lot of people aren't taken to threat modeling, and it's totally understandable. So the big offer is training, which can be on-site or remote. I also work on 1-hour consulting remotely. That's very popular because a lot of people, they have an issue, or they don't necessarily require the in-depth knowledge or benefits that are associated with a retainer or a long-term situation. Sometimes people only have one issue, they have an objective, they need to solve it, or they just have a question about something, like a strategic idea that they have, or how are they going to mount some sort of obstacle that's like, we have construction workers coming in, we have really good, security, but up until this point, we don't know how we're going to keep us from being exposed. Things like that, weird niche things like that can happen, edge cases. That's also something that's very popular. And I would probably say that it's the most common thing that I do is work with people in the remote consultation and also with identification of problems, and specifically insects and things that people aren't familiar with.
Fantastic. Yeah, those are some great points. I mean, the construction worker, example is so spot on, because how many facilities get one room going, then while they're building the next three or the next one, there's always construction in the middle, while you're harvesting, while you're propagating, while you're filling rooms, and you have all these other aspects. I mean, that's so common. Which is great points there. So I know you've done a lot of publishings. What's the count now? I mean, how many articles or books or pieces of writings have you put out there?
Oh, I don't know. I don't know what the exact number is, to be honest.
Roughly.
Roughly, I want to say close to several dozen. I mean, if we include magazines, like for example, I have some examples here.
Mm-hmm.
This is I helped with the new marijuana garden saver by Ed Rosenthal. I helped with that. This was the old one. This was the new one. So I did that. That was a very fun experience. I've also written for Skunk Magazine. And I've also done quite a bit. There's a huge list on my website, Zenthonal.com, where I've talked about my collected works and symposia. I've also done several presentations at various cannabis conferences and also online podcasts and things like that, like the one that I'm having here, which I will definitely be adding to my website as well. So that's just one additional place where I can talk about the importance of integrated pest management.
Absolutely. Well, with that note, let's get into the meat of this. Let's get into understanding, integrated pest management a bit more, right? Where, we're talking pests, we're talking disease, pathogen pressure and everything. So at a nice high level, how would you encompass, defining, the importance of, integrated pest management?
As a strategy, it's kind of the only way to really look at pest management, and I would also say in some ways like cultivation, like just by its sort of definition. And there's several definitions out there that people have used as a concept. I recently did a video about this where I talked about in a live stream where the concept of IPM comes from and how we've gotten from then to here. It's about a 60 plus year old concept, and it's steeped in our understanding of ecology, our understanding of how natural systems function. And so as that information, that knowledge has gotten more sophisticated, so has IPM. Like, we understand how, molecular biology works. We understand how certain organisms are related. We understand how important like the soil microbiome is, or that various microbes in the plant are for its function. And those are all going to have influential impacts on how your plant's going to grow. So although you might not be able to affect a great amount of change as the grower in that moment, potentially, being informed would allow you to, for example, understand why some products work and others might not. Why they perhaps are totally fake. Maybe they are snake oil, essentially. It would allow you to have an informed understanding about why, in a new situation that you haven't ever been in before, you could use information that you know about other organisms to realize, oh, well, this product may work, this product might not work, or this strategy will work, or this strategy won't work. So by knowing even small things like the life cycle of organisms, see, integrated pest management is the integration of various techniques, some of which have different like schools that people like to assign them to, like biological techniques or cultural techniques, which is how you do things. That's the SOP and that sort of a thing. But also kind of merging that with just our scientific understanding of the natural world. All of those things come together and output comes an SOP. So when I go and do a on-site evaluation, we are looking at the plan as it is, how the general property looks, what's your geographic area. All of these will have influence on your pest pressure, for example. If you already know seasonally that you get pests at this time and not during this time, then you know, okay, well, I can prepare in this part of the season for this pest. And maybe I know I can head it up off the pass with a biocontrol. We can apply it strategically and that will obviously reduce costs. It will obviously reduce the labor costs, the product costs. It will also lower the economic yield of the plant produce that you're growing, no matter the plant, whatever it is that you're growing. And in the case of cannabis, obviously, there's very little tolerance for very obvious reasons.
Mm-hmm.
So you really have to be strategic and multi-domain and all of these other buzzwords about response and security and that sort of a thing.
No, you brought up some really good points. The fact that you were saying, these procedures and the kind of cultural aspects of kind of, I figure that was like what the past of IPM used to be, right? Oh, well, you just spray this way with this product and that's it. But there was never much discussion about, the mycology, the plant health, the plant science, what's, natural defenses you could trigger and things like that, like the actual science end of what's happening within the plant. I feel like that wasn't the norm previously, right? And it's becoming the norm now because it's plant science. There's natural, it doesn't involve any other stigma, propaganda, or anything because it's a cannabis plant. It's just basic plant science. So if you understand that aspect of it and how you said combine those two, now you have a well-rounded strategy. So, we're going to dive deeper into, some biofungicides, some bioinsecticides, some real tangible stuff, that people could implement in their gardens. But I was really curious in how you mentioned some of the potential products that could be a total waste of money and effort and resources. I don't want to put any, brands under the bus, but, there's always active ingredients in products. So are there any active ingredients out there or, be it enzymes or something like that, or that are marketed to potentially kill insects or disease and aren't effective in their use, just kind of ingredients and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there are things, like sometimes there are products that are just misapplied. So that's one facet of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there are cases where people have, there are people who are doing this because they have an ambivalence towards whether it works or not. There are people who are doing it because they are, I guess you would say, actively bad. They are in bad faith, tricking people because they know it doesn't work, but they don't care.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are people who they have totally good intentions and they thought that it was this one way, but it actually doesn't work this way. And how they saw it work was either a fluke or there was something else happening at the same time. So I want to make that point because there are people out there who I think are totally fine people and reasonable, and they're not supported by infrastructure that
They're doing their best attempt, right? I mean, it's a good way. I get what you're saying. It's a good way to preface, whatever you will say next. That's a good way to establish that grounding there, because it's true. I mean, this is not about bashing anybody, but if there's something that there's always been some sort of level of myths or just traditions that get passed down and don't really get questioned and are staples in people's gardens. And, like anything else, the truth will come out at some point, and eventually we find out, well, we've been doing this wrong the whole time. We put our best effort, but we're, misapplying, or this product just, wasn't for us.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. And people who follow me on social media will be familiar with this story. So basically, there was a device that somebody was using. So this wasn't like a chemical or anything, like some sort of spray-on product. This was like a device, and this device is supposed to vibrate the plant. And the plant is, according to the person who makes the product, it's supposed to have all of these immune priming effects. This is supposedly based on at least a theoretical understanding of something called thigmopriming, which is a real thing, and is also something that I think is underutilized in the world of pest management and plant health, which is basically gaming the plant response to physical sensation. So plants have various ways in their cells to sort of interact with that on the microscale, and also as sort of a super normal stimulus, let's say. It's not something they would interact with in real life, but we're sort of triggering them. Usually, in this case, where there is immune system benefit, there has to be a certain level of activity for a certain period of time, but you can also overprime the plant. And if you look at the research, you can totally see examples of this, where basically because you're overstressing, because it's a stress response. At the end of the day, it's a stress response. And that creates signals and cascading pathways. Plants have a system for this, and this is something you learn in plant ecology or plant biology now, as we understand more about how plants regulate their resources. They have a finite amount of resources. Mm-hmm. Plants are sessile. So they have to be really good at sectioning off and partitioning the energy resources they have, the finite ones that they get every day through photosynthesis. Some of it goes through the microbiome. Some of it goes on to feed microbes in the roots, for example. Some of it goes on to fight out this caterpillar over here or this fungus over here. And a lot of times they have multiple stressors, from high heat, high UV radiation from various organisms, and those organisms have their own counteractions as well. So there's this cacophony of things going on. But essentially, not to get on a tangent, the research shows that you can overstress a plant. And so this device was supposed to, have this function, but just by asking, how do you know that this device has its effect? Is it vibrating enough? A lot of times the frequency wasn't high enough or didn't have other functions. I don't remember all of the details, but maybe I'll send you some information and we can talk about it in the edit.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's a good point where you said, there's a certain amount of stress to the plant will trigger the plant to respond in a positive way to defend itself, right, against that stressor, right? But like you said, there's a point of, too much is too much, where that plant only has so many resources because it's doing, trying to defend itself at all these different levels of growth, beneath the soil and above the soil. So it's limited to what it could do. So that's a good point. Let's get into some kind of bullet points of common things that growers, especially nurseries, people making clones, are deal with on a normal basis, like damping off, where we get this slimy stem with no roots, where you give the tray a little shake and things just start flopping over and stuff. What are your thoughts on protecting the plant? How to prevent and protect the clone going into a high humid environment, like a rooting process, to help prevent and prevent the damping off?
One thing that I think is underutilized is the use of certain microbes. We talked about it earlier, we alluded to it earlier, but there are all kinds of fungi and even other organisms that are very similar to fungi called oomycetes that can cause this sort of damping off. And generally, although they have their own ways of basically penetrating, overmatching the immune system, and attacking the plant, they really like to make use of wounds too. So a major thing to do would be to not have as many wounds as possible, because those are access points that can be exploited. So that's one thing to consider. That's sort of like a 10,000 foot view, but every little bit counts, right?
That's a good point.
Yeah, if your SOP makes use of that. But also the use of microbes and the applying of certain basically biopesticidal agents. So they're still a pesticide, but they're not a chemical agent. And they form a relationship with the plant. In some cases, you still have to reapply, or that you might want to reapply to make sure that you have a certain number of them. Not that they couldn't have a stable population, but it's almost like just a super protective barrier, right? If you're in this sort of vulnerable state when you're like cutting cuttings and you're
Hmm.
trying to move them, and you just want to make sure that like if it's a vulnerable situation, maybe just a little bit more than normal, nothing wrong with that. You can use those, and they can do two things mainly. They will antagonize the organism. So if the organism is there, obviously, ideally, the organism's not there and you don't get the problem.
Hmm.
But in case it's there, then you have an overabundance of this organism. And there's different kinds out there. There's fungi and bacteria both. And sometimes they antagonize the organism. Basically, they kill it with different compounds or proteins they make. Or in some cases, they parasitize the damping off agent, like if it's a fungus. And so they are going to show it what it feels like to be parasitized, and that's obviously beneficial for the plant. And sometimes they're just free agents that they're roaming around. They don't have a very close tie and connection to the plant. And other times the relationship is a little bit more intimate, but you get a similar result either way.
I like that. These microbes are brutal. They're attacking. They're putting out some pain out there. That's good to know. I mean, I always implement biofungicides and try to get a big diversity of different strains of beneficial bacteria and fungi. In my root zone when I'm doing pre-soaks to just, for me, I view it as building up, a solid defense. It doesn't hurt to have those, bacteria running around with all the microbes and stuff. There's really no harm. I just see nothing but benefit there. So are there some particular favorites, strains or products that are, best to be used on a normal basis?
I would say, in general, it's important to be preventive, but it's also important to be selective because, on the one hand, that's a question that depends on your resources and I think what
Hmm.
your goals are somewhat. I'll say that up front. But generally, if you can afford it and if you want to do that sort of a thing, there's a few different products out there. So, for example, I recently reviewed a research report for botrytis and other agents of bud rot, which is somewhat relevant because some of these pathogens can start in the root system, like fusarium. So fusarium can cause bud rot, believe it or not. We often think of botrytis, and we can talk about this if you want, but we often think of botrytis, but it's actually not even the most common bud rot agent we're finding out. It's this other genus of fungi. So anyways, some of them can start even in the root system, and some of them can start with wounds, and some of them do just start in the floor tissue. But regardless, things like fusarium and pythium and things like that, you can use things like pre-stop. That's a product that could be used in Asperello as well. The research took a look at these two in a different product, and there are three different microbes essentially, two fungi and a bacteria, if I remember correctly, and they were looking at what would happen if you inoculated with them 48 hours before inoculating with the pathogen, and like the difference between not doing it and doing it was like massive.
Okay.
There's sometimes you even have any fungal development, and you can use similar products like these not only for bud rot but also for the fungi that affect your roots, for example. A lot of these microbes can be used in foliar and also in soil environments, but it just depends on your use case.
Yeah, those are two products that I was actually discussing with a client that's based in Canada, since they have more limited options and resources for what they could use and implement in their licensed operations. And those two products were available to them, and I was researching, what they do and what strains they are and stuff. So I was like, yeah, man, the light's green. And get those going. Just get those bio defenses up. So let's talk a little bit about you touched on it. Fusarium. I think is that going to fall in the same category as root rot as well?
Yeah, it can. It can infect through the roots.
So
It's a
like
very opportunistic pathogen, and there's many different kinds of fusarium.
let's touch on that for a minute or so, because I know I've seen it happen, and I saw one of your posts as well that touched on the root rot, where the plant, could have a root zone. It's not like it doesn't have any roots, but it'll just wilt out and die, as if it was, wilting due to thirst, right? Due to a lack of water, and it just looks like this plant is just wilted at every branch, and that's that root rot there. So, you mind, touching on the best way to prevent and or treat? Obviously, if you're starting to see a plant or two in your garden, have these random acts of just, quick wilting, without them being thirsty. Like, well, what's going on with this plant here? What do you do when you start to see that in your garden?
Yeah, well, the first thing is if you start to see this like partial or total wilting, what you're actually seeing is the result of this choke out that's happening with the root pathogen. Because basically, a lot of times these are systemic organisms, so they systemically infect the plant. And a lot of times they basically cut off or limit the movement of fluid, specifically water, through the roots up into the plant. That's going to make all the other processes, from the stem and above, not really work. So that's what the wilting really is. There's a lowering in water pressure, like blood pressure essentially for the plant, and it's starting to wilt. At that point, though, it might be too late. The damage might be too severe, and it's not always the case, but a lot of times it is, because it can happen very, very quickly. It'll happen more frequently in cases where maybe you've overwatered, for example. A lot of people will think of this as like the number one way that you could get it. And I would say it's pretty common, but probably only because overwatering can be really common for a lot of people, especially beginners. And they might not, again, be aware of this pathogen. So, there's this sort of conflation there.
Right.
But to answer the question more fully, if you do see this problem, it's possible that you only have one plant that has this wilting, or sometimes you only see it in one branch. And
Right.
I have definitely encountered it where like somebody has nicked a branch or wounded it in some way. They start to see this colorful fungus. Sometimes it's an orange color or a red color. And that's usually fusarium, because fusarium makes these pigment compounds. They tend to be that color. And so at that point, I definitely had people who were able to like cut it, like notice it, especially when it's just starting out, because they're looking all the time for different examples. See, if you catch it really early, you snip off the branch, and then maybe you even apply one of these microbial products we're talking about. That's super useful, and I've definitely had plants recover. If it's the whole plant at the trunk, though, that can be a real problem, and that could be too much. Oftentimes it is, but I have had people use some of the products we just mentioned, and it killed the plant, or I'm sorry, it killed the plant's problem. And
What's the plant there?
not the plant, but the plant might still be quite stunted afterwards. Basically, what will allow the plant to not be killed is if it can still have some of that vasculature. If it doesn't, it's pretty much dead. If it does, and you've caught it really early, or the plant's very hardy and the infection is kind of slower, then you have a chance for survival. But you really do have to do something that will kill the fungus. Some people like to use other knockdown chemistries, not systemic fungicides and things like that, which we can touch on if you'd like. But these microbial products are actually becoming a lot more sophisticated lately, and I've had great success with them.
Very interesting. Yeah, I mean, in my experience, I've seen it, fusarium spread and kind of stem from contaminated water source, right? Whether that's the combination of the irrigation lines or the plumbing, the pumps, the housings, those little nooks and crannies, they start to add up, and that's what I've seen in my experience. So, everything that got watered was getting watered with, tampered water source. So it's very difficult to try to, maintain and keep up there. But like you mentioned, I think a good point is that chemistry for that initial knockdown, that kind of wipe out, because these beneficial, microbes, this beneficial fungi that'll, defend itself against pathogens. are active and alive. So usually my strategy is to kill everything off and re-inoculate, and let that thrive and live for the next 7 to 14 days, kind of depending on what you got going on in that media, and usually reapply more beneficials, versus having a solid repeat of the chemistry kill off, right? So have a kind of rotation depending on the pressure there. Are you a cannabis grower looking for reliable and accurate pathogen testing for your plants? Look no further than MyFlora DNA. Their state-of-the-art lab offers testing for hop latent viroid, fusarium, as well as other pathogens that can cause harm to your crops. Trust them to provide you the information that you need to ensure the health of your plants. And for a limited time, use discount code CLONECOACH at checkout for up to 20% off your entire order. Don't let pathogens ruin your crop. Choose MyFlora DNA for all of your cannabis testing needs. Now back to the show. That was really good, notes on the fusarium and what to look out for. You touched on scouting, so let's hear the importance of crop scouting, and maybe top tip or two to share out there for people to look out for and make their scouting a lot more effective.
I would say the number one thing would be to have regular scouting. A lot of people do this, but some people don't. Doing it at least once, maybe twice, depends on how many plants you have, and scouting as many as you can. Now, when I work in a commercial capacity, in a professional capacity, people have certain restrictions that they've either inherited from, the fact that the company was made a certain way, or the organizational structure is a certain way, or they have a certain amount of labor, or whatever. These are all factors that have to be considered. In a home grow scenario or a smaller scale scenario, whatever you might consider it to be, then it might be a lot more feasible that you can go after all these plants and take a look. The second thing, having it being regular and having it be the same kind of scouting. Basically, you don't want to just look at the plant and just be like, well, that looks okay, and then continue on. You want to be looking at basically a statistical approach where you're maybe checking a certain number of leaves per plant. Perhaps you are looking at a certain number of leaves at certain parts of the plant. Maybe you're also looking at the roots too. Maybe you're able to do that, maybe you're not able to do that. But you should definitely be checking the stems, for example. And if it's in a vegetative state versus a flowering state, that's also going to be different too. And you're going to want to be able to assess it in a way that doesn't damage the yield, but also is thorough enough that you're actually going to be looking for things. Because ideally, for all of these pests, you want to catch them before they become a problem. In fact, the new strategy, because we know more about how plants operate and how we can bioprime, right, and do all of these other things and release biocontrols, the real ideal is to meet the pest before it comes and then basically slow and erode its growth and eliminate it when it's way more manageable. That can be a little bit more costly. It does require greater preparation, but it's almost always less expensive. No matter what scale you're at, it's almost always less expensive than the requisite increased product or increased labor costs, because your own time is worth a lot to you, right? You don't get any more of that. Doesn't matter if you're in a professional setting or a personal setting, right? So you want to have this SOP essentially so that you can make sure that you catch things before they become a problem.
Absolutely. And what are your favorite beneficial bugs that you say should be a staple in everybody's garden, be it commercial or small or mid scale, to stay on that preventative end of things and catch the common pests like spider mites or aphids or fungus gnats or thrips, these top 4 or 5 common pests that are usually hanging out in gardens. What are some of your favorite beneficial predatory insects to have as a staple?
Probably my favorite is Swirskii cucumeris for your predatory mites. They're type 3 generalists, which means that they go after a range of different pests. Not all pests. It's very important to know, if you don't know, that biocontrols are usually, even if they're generalists, they're usually only going after a selection of pests. So like in Swirskii cucumeris' case, it's whitefly, thrips, broad mite, russet mite. In the case of the first few, the insects like whitefly, they are mostly going after the larvae. So the thrips and the whitefly, they're going after the larvae. They're not really going after the adults so much, which is fine, because one of the advantages of insects is that they're able to reproduce quickly. But if you basically neutralize that, they don't last very long. So, the subsequent population, if it's not increasing enough, then the population will die off, if that makes sense. So
Yeah, absolutely.
I like to use those predatory mites, and they're generally great because you can also subsist them on pollen. You can apply, for example, cattail pollen. There's other pollens that are out there that you can choose from, or perhaps collect your own potentially. And what's really great about them is that the female mites, they need protein to create eggs. Well, pollen doesn't fight back, so they don't have to use as many resources to get a bunch of proteins and fats and things, and then make a bunch of eggs. And so the population oftentimes soars when you apply pollen. Some people, though, sometimes who maybe sell mites, might say that you shouldn't do that because, well, there are other pests that might eat the pollen, and maybe the mites won't be very hungry. I don't actually know the veracity of these claims, to be honest. In my experience, I haven't found this to be an issue, but it's the kind of thing where I could see how somebody on one side might be saying something because they want to sell mites, and other people might be saying things because they want to sell pollen, and maybe it is actually super ambiguous, or maybe there's a clear-cut thing. But it's the kind of thing where if you know these aspects of their biology, you can make an informed decision, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. We'll leave it up for the everybody implementing these strategies to make their own decision on that one. What about things in the root zone to combat fungus gnats and or if they have and or trying to prevent a root aphid infestation or pressure? What are some good predatory bugs there?
For root aphids, it's very difficult. I actually don't rely on any biocontrols. A lot of people, I've heard people say nematodes like Steinernema feltiae, or SF, or Heterohabditis bacteriophora, or HB nematodes, or Steinernema caprocapsi, I believe it's called, or SC. But I don't think those are actually useful. I haven't seen any research that sort of supports that. And I haven't used them to any effect against root aphids. I've had people who are clients who've used them. They haven't found any effect, but some people swear by it. So this is one of the situations where I don't think people are necessarily being malicious, but I think that other things are happening, and perhaps that's explaining it. And I also would say that basically the only thing you can use against them that's a biological are entomopathogenic fungi. Beauveria bassiana is my favorite to use, but you can also use Eiseria fumosorcia. These are found as various products out there. Some of them can even be bought as sort of pure cultures. Others are sort of commercial agents that you need, some sort of license or something to acquire potentially. Other places, not so much. It just depends on your locality and whether you have access to them. But Beauveria bassiana is my favorite. I also like to use a knockdown first before I apply the biocontrol, just to make the efficacy greater, because they do better on, harmed or even dead bodies that will colonize them. For fungus gnats, I like to use a combination of either the Beauveria that we were just talking about, or there are some bacillus products that are useful against flies, and also these sorts of flies, fungus gnats, but also similarly shore flies, which some people encounter, which are not the same thing. But they're often found sort of comorbid in a system that has fungus gnats. I do like to use the nematodes for fungus
Right.
gnats. And probably my favorite thing to use for fungus gnats in particular are standard Nemophiltiae nematodes. They're pretty abundant. They're pretty easy to access. They might be a little bit expensive, especially if you have a small grow. They're a lot more economical if you have a larger sort of grow space, at least. But they work really well, and the upside and downside about them is that they're very quick, which is great, but that also means that they don't last very long in the medium. And I think they do a lot better in soil, but they also work in other media as well.
So on that note, I know storing the nematodes is critical as well. So what are your tips on storing them if you have a package or two that you're gonna, you know, give out to your plants once a week for the next 4 weeks or something? What's the best way to store nematodes for effectiveness?
It's usually product specific, but typically storing them in a refrigerator at a certain pretty cool temperature, but not frozen.
Hmm.
And also, um, typically you want to apply the entire package or packet or however they're coming in. There's different ways that nematodes come in. So, that's very important. So you talk with the producer and know what the details are before you get them, because in some places you might not be able to provide the right um, storage for the
Right.
nematodes. And I would say, yeah, the number one thing that people misuse nematodes for is a small application that they then try to store afterwards. And in a lot of cases, not all cases, but in a lot of cases, products are not meant to be used in that way. So you should just use the whole one, which is why it can be a little bit wasteful for a small grow.
Interesting. Very good point. Let's transition into, another very common, pathogen that's riddled cannabis for forever, which is powdery mildew. So what are some on the plant science and the natural plant defense end of things? What are some things that you could do to ensure your plant is defending itself against, pathogen pressure like powdery mildew? And if you are, starting to see some spots come up, what are your best strategies to eradicate?
I like to use potassium bicarbonate products as a reactive measure.
Hmm.
You could use it as a preventative measure, and it's better as a preventative, but that would assume that you're predicting that's going to be there. And the first, at least for some species, the first 110, 120 hours of infection is basically invisible to the naked eye. You're not going to find the example by crop scouting. So
Uh-huh.
at that point, the population, your plant is probably either failed to resist it or has sort of slowed its growth potentially, but still has it and will probably continue to have it as it grows. So, for example, if you created a situation where you're pretty sure that the powdery mildew spores that are very likely in your environment in a lot of cases, you're not growing in a clean room after all, and powdery mildew is so prolific. So is
Hmm.
botrytis and a lot of other these fungi. You're literally breathing these spores in. I guarantee it. When you go outside, you are perhaps even inside as well. Maybe different spores, but some of these eventually as well. And so they get everywhere. You can't really control that. But what you can control is the environment sometimes. And you can also control I guess you could say, the microclimate. So by doing things like this, if you already, if you know it's going to be raining, or that it's going to be very foggy, or that the environment is going to be inclement in a way that might help the fungi to grow,
Uh-huh.
maybe even seasonally, that it comes around this time, apply it preventatively. But in addition to that, you can do things like applying things like there are some silica products out there that will help create a very turgid cell wall
Hmm.
in the plants. It gets sequestered in that way. But I believe it also, I've read, has a sort of an immune priming effect as well. And like I stated earlier, it's important to really consider what that means, because in plants, they have these pathways, they have these immune signaling pathways. There's a few major ones. And basically, if you prime in the wrong direction, then the plant will actually be vulnerable rather than being strengthened. You can't just say, oh, I'm priming the immune system. Too vague. You really got to know what it is you're priming. And my understanding is that there are silica products out there that prime it in the correct way. Not only that, but also have a physical effect as well.
Hmm.
And like you said, by knowing the science behind it, you know what you're doing, how it works, and you also know that it works because you know the science backing it, rather than just trusting somebody who tells you that it's this magical product that just benefits the plant man, you know, just makes the immune system gooder. You know, it's not good enough, and don't roll over for that kind of explanation as much as possible. Because it might sound too good to be true, but you know, look at the actual information that supports it, and then get somebody's second or third opinion.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, because kind of what you mentioned earlier, where everybody has their goals and intentions. So if their intention is to push more silica products, they may tell you whatever you want to hear, so that you could purchase more of their products. But as long as the plant is getting the response that it needs to defend itself, I always say that the plant will do the talking for me, right? Like the plant, whether if it's healthy or not, or if it's fully rooted, like that should be something that's just not an argument. You could look at it, analyze it, look at that plant and say, yeah, it's a healthy plant. What are your thoughts on on that same subject of plant science and natural ways to defend itself on amino acids and calcium uptake?
So I do know that calcium can be useful as sort of another like rigidity enhancing
Of
product
the
or
cell walls,
effect.
right?
Yeah, but also so for amino acids, the benefit is that those free amino acids can be taken up and then sort of utilized for protein synthesis. So the more amino acids you have, the more that you have available for the plant and for the cells to use this. There's not really a difference. Perhaps there is. I don't want to overspeak for myself, but my understanding is at least that this is the case, that an amino acid is an amino acid for the most part. Of course, they need different ones and different amounts. And I suppose if you also want to look at it a different way, if you have the microbiome, or if you're concerning the microbiome in the plant, as there are microbes, there are bacteria, and there are fungi living in the tissue of the plant. In fact, right this moment, obviously, there's some in your own body currently, in your gut and other parts of your body, as a human, as an animal, whatever, right? So there are these factors, and so maybe amino acids are also absorbed by these products too.
Hmm.
These factors as well, these microbes can then maybe synthesize with those as well. That is somewhat speculative, but I think it's an important thing to consider, considering how intimate the relationship can be and how a lot of times these microbes are in some way sustaining themselves in the plant. And I think that that is part of the way that this happens, at least to some degree. There are also other, you know, food or metabolite products that are then maybe taken up either in mycorrhizae that are outside or somewhat inside the roots, or in this case where the endophytes are a little bit more intimate, living in or very close to these channels like phloem and xylem channels.
Fantastic. Yeah, man. Well, Matthew, I think there's so much more knowledge that we could potentially dive into and be here for hours, right? Especially if we had some, real specific case studies and stuff to try to dive into and diagnose. But we're going to get towards the end of the show here. I wanted to pick your brain a bit on your outlook on the future. So kind of factoring in technology, the global economy, kind of the political status of cannabis changing throughout the world. What do you think the future of this cannabis industry looks like, in the future for us?
I do think about this a lot, and I try to synthesize a bunch of information like this, so it's an excellent question. I feel like I feel like things could get a little bit worse before they get better, to be honest, in
Hmm.
some ways, in a legislative way. I have cautious optimism, but I could see it going a different way just looking at the politics around. I do see that, at least in the United States, I'm talking more globally, but I do feel like in the United States, at least, there is this greater cautious optimism. There are some laws that maybe have been struck down that I'm kind of excited about because I maybe didn't like everything that was in them. I was cautious about how they would be implemented and things like this, specifically for MSOs, for example.
Hmm.
Um, I feel as though on the pest side, at least, there are several problems that the cannabis community lacks the infrastructure to overcome in a really sophisticated way, because the discrimination against cannabis for so long has rendered all the infrastructure gone. And so
Mhm.
they aren't able to, in some ways in some ways it's been a boon, because I think that cannabis hasn't been affected by uh, some of the things that have happened in agritech and that kind of a thing. So perhaps that was a benefit, but there are also great detriments to that, and some of that is just starting to be worked on, like understanding the genome of the plant, understanding what these different traits are that cannabis has, what are the components that underlie them, and how can we as breeders facilitate them in a natural way or sort of optimized way, and sort of interbreeding and getting lines from perhaps wild, or the very least sort of feral cannabis populations, land race, and that kind of thing. So I'm excited about that. I'm also excited about certain countries opening up, and to be honest, I think it's a massive cultural wrong that certain countries aren't able to enjoy it, despite, especially considering the historical cultural importance. And I particularly am talking about China, but in particular the various minorities and other groups within the bloc of the PRC currently, and
Hmm.
as well various other Southeast Asian states and even Japan for that matter. So I'm excited to see that perhaps become more accepted as a growing global enjoyment of cannabis, and also cultural acceptance of cannabis and perhaps other drugs too, swells. I do think that it's swelling, and I do think it's generally going in a positive direction.
Yeah, and I'm right there with you, man. I think, we're blessed to live in the generation that we're living in, and experiencing these massive cultural changes, in our lives that are affecting people all over the world, man. And this is, a change in the right direction. This is going to do nothing but benefit society if we, manage this rollout, this decriminalization, this destigmatization of soft drugs, as they've been labeled. It's just going to benefit society, in my point of view. So thank you for your insight there, Matthew. That was really insightful, and I think it really gave the listeners a good point of view. So, but thank you so much for joining us today on Clone Talk. Where can the audience learn more about you, learn more about your publishings, and get in contact with you?
So, for professional inquiries, you can contact me at zenthanol.com. You can also find me on various social media sites. I have a Twitter. My personal Twitter is at SyncAngel. That's SYNCHANGEL, like synchronize. The same username for Instagram as well, where I post a lot of these digested comments and commentaries about plant science, plant health, and integrated pest management. And I think it's been incredibly valuable for other people. I get a lot of support. And if you want to support my free work and my videos on Zenthanol, the YouTube channel, and other social media, you can subscribe to my Patreon for as little as $1 a month. You also get access to my Discord server, where there's about 130 or 140 of us at this point. We're all interested in IPM, who help each other with IPM. So if you have an ID question or something like that, I think that information should be available to people as much as possible. And this is one easy way for me to funnel a lot of that questioning into one location, so it's easy for me to tackle for everyone. So I'm excited for our mutual success if you're interested in that.
Yeah, that sounds fantastic. I mean, I think every grower should have that type of resource in their back pocket, where they could go to versus Google. They could go to that channel, get some direct expertise, get some direct questions answered, instead of, going down the rabbit hole. I mean, I've, gone down the rabbit hole once or twice, searching a subject or two. So, Thank you for that. I'll plug all those details into the notes so that everybody could reach out and get in touch with you some more. But that's going to do it for today's episode for Clone Talk. I hope you guys gained some value, some tangible value that you could implement in your gardens today. And if you're ready to make the best clones ever, head on over to clonecoach.com. That's where I offer expert guidance and step-by-step instructions on how to make the best clones ever. So I'm Paul, your clone coach, your host for today. Thank you, Matthew. We'll see you on the next one. Attention licensed operators in California. Are you looking for high-quality nursery stock? Look no further than Refined Genetics. They provide top-notch clones, teens, and seeds to ensure the success of your operation. No order is too big. For a limited time, use discount code CloneCoach for 10% off your first order. Don't miss out on this opportunity to secure a solid nursery partner. Contact sales@refinedgenetics.co. And yes, it's .co, not .com. Catch you on the next episode of Clone Talk. Do you want to be a guest on Clone Talk? It's easy. Just send me an email. heyclonecoach@gmail.com. We'll get you all set up. I look forward to having you on the next episode.